the evolution, but it hasn't been lost. So here we are, we don't know what this receptor is supposed to be doing, and at the same time, we know that dioxins can mess around with it with horrible consequences. What are those consequences? Well, first of all, as I said before, dioxins accumulate in animal fat. And this is one of my own papers back in 1986. 1 litre of cow's milk will give you the same dose of dioxin as if you, as a human being, stood next to the cow for 8 months. If you breathe the air next to the cow, the cow's munching the grass, you're just breathing. You're breathing for 8 months, is it? 8 months is the equivalent of 1 litre of cow's milk. So somebody earlier on was asking me, is this only of concern to the people in Arecibo? No! It's a concern of anybody on this island that eats food, especially animal fat. Because if you contaminate that animal fat with dioxin, then everybody is going to get it. Now, in one day, just to show you what these cows are like, in one day, a grazing cow puts the equivalent of 14 years of human breathing. 14 years of breathing. They're like vacuum cleaners for dioxin. So this is important too, because there's a lot of people on this island that say, oh, those poor people in Arecibo. Oh dear, those poor people. They see this stack, and you see that stack, and you see that tall stack means dilution. Dilution. By the time it gets to me, at the other end of the island, it will be so dilute, my kids don't have to worry. Except what we know is that nature reconcentrates. The stack dilutes. Nature, fish, grazing animals, pigs, chicken, goats, sheep, and cows will reconcentrate the dioxin and deliver it in our food. That's the problem. Now, the next thing that's a problem is once we get the dioxin into our body, we can't get rid of it. When I say we here, I'm being very sexist. Men cannot get rid of the dioxin. See, normally the liver converts fat-soluble products into water-soluble products, and then the kidney goes to work and gets rid of them. Doesn't work for dioxin. The liver cannot convert the most toxic forms of dioxin into a fat-soluble byproduct, which means you're stuck with it. They concentrate in your fat, and if you look at a man's fat, over time, the fat will get more and more concentrated with dioxin. But a woman, I told you it's going to be difficult and challenging. A woman, but a woman can get rid of this dioxin in her fat. And the answer is by having a baby. So the woman concentrates the dioxin in her fat for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. Then when she has the first baby, in 9 months, it will move from her body fat to the fetus. And that's the real problem. That's when the fetus is met with a concentration which is astronomically higher than the mother has met. And so the highest doses of dioxin goes to the fetus and the breastfed baby. And for a long time, nobody seemed to worry about this. And then in an article in the Lancet, British Medical Journal, 1992, a group of doctors there examined 38 newborn babies. They divided them into 2 groups. One group had low exposure to dioxins, based upon the level in mother's fat. These were average women. These were women from all over the Netherlands. They weren't pulled out because they were known to be exposed. The average for those, the low level, was 18.6 parts per trillion. And then the high exposed, the average was 37.5. So about a 2 to 1. 2 to 1 difference in the average population. And then when the babies were born, they looked at their thyroid hormone levels. And what they found was after 1 week, the babies were showing a statistical difference, significant difference in thyroid hormone levels. At 1 week, which continued into 11 weeks. So this was the first time that anybody had observed a change in human beings based upon not an accident, not Agent Orange in Vietnam, but based upon backward levels in the food supply of the population. And that's when they started to get really worried. So what we now know is that dioxins act like fat-soluble hormones. They disrupt male and female sex hormones, thyroid hormones, insulin, gastrin, and glucocorticoid. Linda Birnbaum, who's now the current head of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in the United States, did this excellent paper in 1995, summarized what we knew about it then. Shortly afterwards, there was a book called A Stolen Future, went into the whole notion of endocrine disruption. This is the beginning of the discussion of endocrine disruption, where man-made chemicals interfere with hormonal signals. And why is it that concern? Answer, because hormones function at exquisitely low concentrations, parts per billion, parts per trillion even. So when you get a chemical that interferes or mimics a hormone, then you don't need very much of it. And that's why they are so toxic, because you don't need very much to interfere with our hormonal systems. Scary stuff. Now, the Institute of Medicine in 2003 were pointing out some of these problems. Cut a long story short, what they recommended was that young girls, well before pregnancy, eat less animal fat. That young girls should substitute low-fat or skim milk for whole milk and foods lower in animal fat. Even though this was covered in the New York Times, it didn't go very far, because the politicians didn't have what it took to tell the American population, because of contamination from industry and from particularly incineration, we're going to have to change the diet of our population. We are going to fundamentally interfere with the diet of young girls by telling them not to drink whole milk and not to get animal fat. Now, I argued then, and I argued now. It would be far less draconian to our society to eliminate incineration from the face of the earth than to go about trying to limit women's breastfeeding. That was the other thing that they said. Limit women's breastfeeding or change their diet. That is draconian. Getting rid of incineration is just like a little pinprick. Except, of course, it's big money. It's big interest. So when you get into dioxin, what are you doing? You're finding big money. You're crossing the interest of the paper industry that uses chlorine to bleach. You're crossing swords with the chemical industry, which produces dioxin as byproducts of the manufacture of things like PVC. You're crossing swords with the waste industry because of incineration. And you're crossing swords with the animal industry, with the beef industry, with the dairy industry, because they too do not want anybody to reduce the consumption of their products. Big money. And big money buys politics. Now, in 1992, they began a reassessment of dioxin. 1992. Within 2 years, the EPA had that reassessment finished. The industry, those industries I just told you about, have spent 20 years making sure that dioxin reassessment never saw the light of day. And that's what politics can do in this country. And if you don't know it now, you're certainly going to learn it. This country is run by corporations. Whether it's the banking industry, the agricultural industry, the pharmaceutical industry, you name it, they run this country. Not us. But the good news is We can fight back by taking local control. We need to make sure that our water never goes into private hands, to make sure if we possibly can, we ban GMOs from this island, that we don't have incineration in this island, that we look after our own resources in that waste, that we do our best to get organic agriculture and things like this that we can do to protect ourselves. Don't look for the EPA or other regulatory agencies or anybody else to protect you. It's only you that can protect your future, this island's future, and your children's future, in my island. And I've got the wonderful scheme, zero waste, in a moment. Okay, so get dioxin out of our food. So while modern incinerators have reduced dioxin emissions, there's no real accountability here. You need three things to protect the citizen from air emissions. You need strong regulations, you need adequate monitoring, you need tough enforcement. If either the monitoring is weak or the enforcement is weak, then those regulations will not protect you. And look at the monitoring for dioxin. Dioxins are measured once or maybe twice a year. They know a month ahead of time when they're going to be measured, and they're going to have 3 tests, 3, 4, 5, 6-hour tests, and based upon those results, at best is 18 hours, they'll have 18 hours of ideal data to extrapolate to 8,000 hours of real operation. This is scientific poppycock, and yet it's what people around the country believing is protecting them. There's no accountability. To add one more atrocity to this whole discussion, everything I've said about metals, everything I've said about dioxins, now we have to translate to Osvaldo's discussion. They're all coming out in nanoparticles. And if you think there's lack of accountability in dioxins, look at the lack of accountability in nanoparticles. The particles that are regulated from incinerators are 10 microns. And yes, they might go down to 2.5 microns, but neither 10 nor 2.5 take care of the nanoparticles over here. So here is the most serious potential threat. And if you weren't listening when Osvaldo said nanoparticles were developed to deliver drugs to the brain, to evade defense mechanisms, oh my God. One of the potentially most serious aspects of incineration, namely nanoparticles, is not even regulated. And they're not even monitored. You can't ring up the EPA and say, what are the nanoparticle emissions from this incinerator? They won't happen because they're not measuring them. They have a blank check. And also, I think Osvaldo would have said that we know in the United States that many, many cities have respiratory problems which are relatable to particle sizes. The higher the particle emissions in your city, the higher the particle levels are in the city, the higher the disease rate and the higher the death rate. And what's more, as the particles measured get smaller, that relationship gets stronger. That's happening right now on Puerto Rico. People are dying and people are getting sick because of these particles in the air. And what you're proposing to do is to put into this air mass the most vicious particles that we've ever looked at, namely the nanoparticles. So they're not efficiently captured by air pollution control devices. They travel long distances. They remain suspended for long periods of time. They penetrate deep into the lungs. And yes, as Osvaldo pointed out, there's no defense. They go straight through the membranes of the lung, of the gastrointestinal tract. They enter the bloodstream, go to every tissue in the body, and yes, I'm using the same photograph. These particles end up in every tissue that they've studied, including the brain. That's pretty disturbing stuff. There was an excellent article written about this in 2006 in one of the world's leading environmental health journals by Stéphanie Cormier. And there was also a statement, which I can make sure you have a copy of, by Vivian Howard, Professor Vivian Howard, brilliant man. A 30-page summary of the concerns about nanoparticles. To the best of my knowledge, the industry has no response to Howard's statement or that article. In fact, when I debated the head of any energy answers here in Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, I asked him for a response to Howard's article, and nothing, nada, nothing. So basically, the industry is flying blind on the most disturbing aspect of incineration activity. But even if we made incinerators safe, even if we found a safe place for the ash, and had a way of controlling these emissions, we would never make incineration a sensible idea. Back to the beginning. Incineration is trying to perfect a bad idea. Our task in the 21st century is not to get find better ways to destroy discarded materials. That's not our task. Our task is to stop making packaging and products that have to be destroyed. And if you appreciate that, you'll appreciate what zero waste is trying to do. Instead of trying to get rid of all this residual crap that's left over after we've recycled and reused and composted, which we know we can do, we have to study that and stop making. That's our task. No, we won't do it overnight. It may take us 20 years, but clearly it's no solution just to turn around like Rambo, get out a flamethrower and zap the stuff. That's not the future. We have to face it. Now, that's more or less where I wanted to be. The waste problem is not going to be solved with better technology, but with better organization, better education, better industrial design. These are the key components of a zero waste strategy. So that's the last part of my presentation, is the zero waste strategy. I suggest you probably want to jump up and have a 5-minute break. Okay? All right, 5 minutes.